For as long as I can remember, being a Spider-Man fan has been rough. In the 90s, there was the Clone Saga in the comics, which had Peter Parker step away as Spider-Man, replaced by his clone Ben Reilly. Then, around the same time, you also had the conclusion of the beloved 1990s Amazing Spider-Man animated TV series, which left the series on a forever unresolved cliffhanger. Then, moving into the early 2000s, you had the Sam Raimi and Tobey Maguire Spider-Man movie franchise, which brought the character back, only for the 2007 Spider-Man 3 sequel to basically crater the whole franchise, and leave fans with a rather sour taste in their mouth. And then, in November of that same year, Spider-Man fans got the ultimate stab in the gut from the One More Day storyline, undoing Peter Parker and Mary Jane's marriage and regressing back decades of development, characters, and history for the entire comic franchise. Since then, while the rest of Spider-Man media has been either hit or miss, we got some good Spider-Man games, we had the Spider-Verse movies, the comics have continued to hurt, disappoint, and even sometimes taunt longtime fans of your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. Spider-Man as Peter Parker is just not allowed to grow up, evolve, change, develop relationships, or be in any kind of good place as far as the comics and those in charge of them are concerned. And as a fan of the character, it's been beyond painful to see Peter go through setback after setback again and again and again. Now, it is worth noting that amidst all the pain and disappointment over the years, there have been bright spots here and there, even in the medium of comic books. You had some alternate versions of Spider-Man where he continued to age, get married, have children, and there was even a beautiful limited series that actually explored Peter's life, his entire life, giving him a conclusive ending in Spider-Man Life Story, which came out in 2019. But these things were either self-contained, non-canon stories, or they just didn't stick around for very long as status quo changes. After these brief nods to happier times, fans would just run smack dab into another round of the constant belittling of Peter Parker in the main 616 comic continuity. It got to the point where nihilism just set in. It became the new reality. For longtime fans, it became a question of whether this was going to be what they'd be getting till the end of time. It certainly seemed that way, at least. To that end, it seemed like longtime fans would either have to accept this reality, or have to understand that Spider-Man just wasn't for them anymore. Peter would never grow up, be happy, or move forward. And the best thing for fans who were moving past that stage of their own lives was that they just wouldn't be able to relate to their favorite character anymore. So, the solution was most likely to forget about Spider-Man and Peter Parker and just move on to other stories, characters, and sources of entertainment. And that really did seem like the best approach, for a good 17 years after One More Day happened. But then, in 2023, which was last year, at New York Comic Con, something big happened, and things changed. Marvel Comics, at their Next Big Thing panel, announced that the Ultimate line of comics, their long dormant and dead comic book line, would not only be revived and redone, but would come back in an entirely new way. This new launch would feature a new universe, both separate from the old discontinued Ultimate universe and the main 616 universe as well. And the headliner comic series for this new line and universe from Marvel Comics? None other than a new Ultimate Spider-Man comic book. This new comic book series would not only feature an older in his mid-30s Peter Parker that was married to Mary Jane, but he'd have 2 kids and be a family man while being Spider-Man. To say that longtime fans of Spider-Man were both excited and a bit trepidatious would likely be the understatement of the decade. Some people were, of course, genuinely excited to see what they had been asking for years finally happening. Other people, like me, who had kind of been off and on with Spider-Man comics for their own sanity's sake, were cautiously optimistic. We were hoping that the writer and architect of this new universe and Spider-Man series, Jonathan Hickman, would finally deliver something worthwhile for this property, even if we expected to be disappointed yet again. And then, in early 2024, as the excitement and fear came to a boiling point, something magical happened. Ultimate Spider-Man issue number 1 came out in January of 2024, and it did really well. The issue sold out 3 times in just 2 months. Sales for this comic were amazing, sensational, spectacular, and whatever other adjective you wanted to put in there that was related to Spider-Man. Even more exciting was the fact that if you had looked at the sales for the comic issue with the standard and alternate variant covers separately, then Ultimate Spider-Man would have claimed 8 of the top 10 most sold comics in those months. That was massive. And this trend just kept going. Ultimate Spider-Man proceeded to beat the sales of the main Spider-Man comics from the 616 universe 3 months in a row. Suffice to say, fans loved this new incarnation and reimagining of Spider-Man. And for those who have either not been keeping up with or are looking to figure out what all the fuss is about, well, there's definitely a lot to unpack here. To start, what perhaps is most interesting about Ultimate Spider-Man, the 2024 version, is that while it features an older Peter Parker that's married and has kids, there are stark, fundamental core differences between this version of Peter Parker and the one that fans have known and grown to love over the years and decades since the web-slinger has been around. It's actually really impressive that despite how much Jonathan Hickman messes with the base formula and ingredients that make up Spider-Man, Ultimate Spider-Man continues to not only do well commercially, but is loved by so many longtime fans, myself included. So, let's uncover all of that. Why is Ultimate Spider-Man, the 2024 version, seemingly so darn good? How is it different from the traditional Spider-Man from the 616 comics? What is this new incarnation of the Ultimate Universe doing that's different? And most importantly, how does all of this relate to Ultimate Spider-Man and its success? Now, a warning before we begin. I'm going to spoil a lot of the Ultimate Invasion miniseries, the Ultimate Universe one-shot, and some related things in the Ultimates comic series in this video. This is all stuff that leads up to Ultimate Spider-Man and provides much-needed setup and context to the story in the comic book. So, if you want to go into all of this blind, I'll say go ahead and read Ultimate Invasion issues 1 to 4, Ultimate Universe, the one-shot, and then proceed to read Ultimate Spider-Man. You'll have a grand time. Beyond that, I will spoil a few tidbits here and there from the first few issues to make a few points and explain the appeal of the new comic series. So, if the idea of any of that is irksome to you, then well, as usual, viewer discretion is advised here. Okay, so before we jump into all of the Ultimate Universe stuff, I think it's worth briefly talking about the real sore spot that's been plaguing Spider-Man and his fandom for the past 17 years. One more day. Yes, I know it's like beating a dead horse at this point, so I'm not going to rehash One More Day too much. I mean, it's not that great for my own mental health to cover that particular topic, and there's a ton of stuff online about it already. But, for our purposes, let's just go over the very broad strokes. First of all, Peter undoes his marriage via a deal with Marvel's version of the devil, Mephisto. And he does this in order to save his Aunt May. Things then get reset. A lot of people who know about Spider-Man forget that he is Peter Parker. Lots of characters regress back or change in terms of where they are. And Peter goes back to being a single guy in his mid-20s with no real career, struggling to make rent, and he's barely getting by. I mentioned that Peter tends to get constantly destroyed by those handling the 616 universe. And this was unfortunately just the tip of the iceberg. While One More Day left Peter in a sort of regressed state, The stories that followed did sometimes attempt to push Peter towards some sort of progress and development. He'd find a new girlfriend, he'd start a new job, he'd get mind swapped with Dr. Octopus, only to come back and run a huge company, and then, almost every time, he'd lose it all and wind up right back where he started with One More Day. Again and again and again. To say that the stories here started to lose their meaning is putting it lightly. I mean, comics are already notoriously bad with character deaths, as nearly everyone can come back and no one really stays dead for too long. But with Peter Parker and Spider-Man, this whole thing extended to every aspect of his life and backstory. And in response to this sense of stasis, longtime fans went in a few different directions to cope with it all. Some took to making really deep, introspective videos on the topic, like say Alex Lennon's big breakout video on One More Day. Some smart people just walked away from Spider-Man comics entirely, or at the very least, took an extended break. But then, there were the hopeful fans that would either stick around or at least check in with Spider-Man every now and then. And these fans? Oh boy, were they led on by Marvel Comics and the editorial team behind Spider-Man. There were moments and headlines like, Peter and MJ are getting back together. It's finally happening. Peter is actually going to get some success and get somewhere. These were the carrots that were dangled in front of fans for years. There was the Nick Spencer run, for instance, which started out as a breath of fresh air for so many fans. But what it ultimately ended up becoming was a bait and switch. It did sort of restore Peter and MJ as a couple at the start of the run, but it tended to keep them apart as much as possible, while also teasing a potential romantic proposal from Peter Parker. It hinted that Peter was also finally starting to remember and would have to come to terms with his big decision at the end of One More Day. And yet, none of that went anywhere definitive. Instead of potentially retconning One More Day, like the story had been teasing for so long, what Nick Spencer ended up retconning was a different story involving Gwen Stacy and Norman Osborn called Sins Past. Not a bad thing in itself, but a far cry from what fans had wanted and had been teased for throughout the run. Now, it's unknown whether this was always the plan, or if Nick Spencer simply got overruled by the Spider-Man editorial team. But in either case, the end result was fans being reminded of One More Day without getting any sort of resolution that they had been promised. And then came Zeb Wells' turn in the writer's chair. Again, it's worth stating that fans were genuinely excited for Wells to take on Spider-Man, as he had written some of the more interesting and loved stories in the period following One More Day called Brand New Day. We won't get into Brand New Day, but it was this weird period before a more regular writer was selected for Spider-Man, and the comic would come out 4 times a month and cycle through different writers and artists. Alright, so, with Zeb Wells finally being the main regular writer for Spider-Man, there came another reset and reconfiguration of Peter's life and relationship dynamics. And this reset threw him back into an extremely dark place. Peter was not only single again and seemingly separated from Mary Jane, but everyone around him, in terms of friends, family, and even superhero colleagues, were done with him. And, to add insult to injury, as the story progressed and the mystery behind Peter's situation became apparent, it showed readers that Mary Jane's character had been changed and twisted to suit a story where she would leave and continue to push Peter away and settle in with a new partner, Paul. Once again, I'm going to point you all to an excellent video by Alex Lennon, where he breaks down what Paul means and what he is to longtime Spider-Man fans, beyond just being a new romantic partner for Mary Jane. Suffice to say, Paul, Mary Jane, and the 616 stories were another huge stab in the chest for longtime fans. And it's all of this the fallout from One More Day, and everything that's followed it in recent years that sets the stage for Ultimate Spider-Man coming out early this year in January of 2024. For fans who had been beaten, battered, and bruised for 17 years with regards to Peter Parker's character arc, Ultimate Spider-Man felt like a decadent meal after a long period of starvation. And for some fans, this all just seemed too good to be true. And I was right there among the skeptics. So I cautiously went into Ultimate Spider-Man, attracted by the idea of an older, grown-up, and more evolved Peter Parker. And what did I find? Well, let's just say it wasn't quite what I was expecting. See, in the Ultimate Universe, things are very different in terms of Spider-Man's backstory and origin. Now, here's your first spoiler warning, as I'm going to quickly summarize the events of Ultimate Invasion and Ultimate Universe, because I believe they're essential to the setup, understanding, and even enjoyment of the Ultimate Spider-Man comics. Okay, so the Ultimate Universe, the new one, is actually a universe that foundationally is very similar to the main 616 universe. Where things get weird is with a character and a villain known as the Maker. The Maker is actually a version of Reed Richards, Mr. Fantastic from the Fantastic Four, and he comes from the original Ultimate Comics line from the early 2000s. You know, the one that got discontinued when that universe itself was destroyed. In any case, the Maker is actually a Darth Vader-style fall from grace and gone evil version of Mr. Fantastic, who survived the destruction of his own universe, and he's kind of been bouncing around in the larger 616 Marvel universe. He's had a few appearances in various 616 universe comics, where he's generally been up to something or the other in the background, while other major storylines, like say the whole Venom Null storyline, happens. And it turns out that that something was the reworking and rewriting of an entire universe to fit his vision and preferences of how things should be. That is essentially what the new Ultimate Universe is. The Maker, having escaped captivity in the 616 universe, actually travels to a different universe and goes through time, changing core events and moments in said universe. In this Ultimate Universe, the biggest example of what the Maker does is when he prevents a young Peter Parker from being bitten by a radioactive spider, preventing him from getting his powers and from ever becoming Spider-Man. It's the definitive moment where Peter visits that science presentation but comes out unchanged. And the Maker does this to a lot of superheroes, either corrupting them and bringing them to his side, or flat out changing their lives and making them ordinary, inconsequential elements in the grand scheme of things. It's then that a bunch of things happen, which temporarily incapacitate the Maker and also give this universe's Tony Stark both the knowledge of what happened and a time machine to potentially fix things. So, with the Maker currently AWOL, Tony Iron Lad Stark gets to work and sends various heroes both the information about who they were supposed to be and a catalyst to give them their powers and abilities. And that is where Ultimate Spider-Man starts. Peter receives Tony's little gift and has to make a choice. Does he become the hero that he was supposed to be when he was younger? This Peter, who is in his 30s, is happily married, has a stable job, and has 2 kids, a family, responsibilities, and whatnot. Can he become a hero at this point? Should he become a hero at this point? That's the core issue that Peter Parker struggles with in Ultimate Spider-Man's first issue. But there's a lot more in that issue that complicates things, less so for Peter and more so for the readers coming into this comic. Now, this is your second spoiler warning, by the way, as we're going to jump into the first few issues of Ultimate Spider-Man and touch on a few things here and there. See, as a reader who wants to see Peter Parker actually older, married, and continuing to be Spider-Man, there is already a wrinkle of sorts in that this Peter Parker has never actually been Spider-Man before, and is just going to start now, much later than the original 616 Spider-Man did before. And that's certainly a change, but that's not all that's different. In this reality, since Peter never becomes Spider-Man as a teenager, a lot of notable stuff just doesn't happen. For one, Peter's a photojournalist, not a scientist, which is quite a twist on the established idea of the science nerd who tinkers and comes up with his own devices and weapons and builds his web shooters, etc., etc. So, this Peter, is a markedly different person. But how different is he? Well, because Peter never became Spider-Man, he never caused Uncle Ben's death. So, in this reality, the formative moment of where Peter Parker learns the whole "with great power comes great responsibility," that whole event, that never happens either. To, in fact, make matters weirder, in this reality, it's not Uncle Ben who's dead, but it's Aunt May, which, while on the one hand is a rather interesting shift, on the other, it's such a fundamental change to the core mythos of Spider-Man that it definitely takes a second to process. And as the comic series goes on, you see more big changes to the original formula of Spider-Man. Staying on Uncle Ben for a moment, he's not only been present as a constant father figure to Peter leading into adulthood, but continues to act as a guiding father figure. They've not only both endured the loss of May, but what's even stranger is that Uncle Ben himself ends up going to some rather different interesting places career-wise. Here, in this universe, he's actually best friends with J. Jonah Jameson, and he works at the Daily Bugle of all places. And thus, because of this, Jameson is actually a family friend and has a rather cordial, uncle-like relationship with Peter, contrasting immensely from the adversarial boss-like relationship that they have in the 616 universe. There's actually this really touching moment in the first issue, where Peter is about to go to a memorial for his aunt and a bunch of other victims of a terrorist attack, and Jameson notices that Peter doesn't have a tie on, so he gives him his own. There's a real sense of family in this scene, and it's just so nice and heartwarming to see. It's nice to see Jameson be a good, positive figure in Peter's life, as opposed to the menace he's been in the main comics, as different and weird as that may seem. So, what else is different? Well, Peter's entire history and progress through college and life seems to have changed quite a bit as well. Peter never went to school with Harry Osborn or Gwen Stacy. He married Mary Jane, of course, but how they met and all of that is undoubtedly different from how Mary Jane helps Peter through his grief of losing Gwen to the Green Goblin in the main continuity. How that all is, we still don't know, but I'm sure that'll be revealed as time goes on. Oh, and the Green Goblin and Norman Osborn? That never happens either, because much like Aunt May, Norman Osborn also dies in a terrorist attack. The same terrorist attack, actually, which has its roots in what Tony Stark and the Ultimates are dealing with in the main Ultimates comic and storyline. So, there's a lot to uncover in how the larger story of the universe connects to Peter, but it does so in very fundamental, character-defining ways. There's definitely a lot going on behind the scenes, and it's amidst all of this that Peter ultimately decides to become Spider-Man. Now, what's different here is also how that decision comes about. Instead of deciding this on his own after making a huge mistake, it's actually after the support and a collection of discussions with both his wife and his Uncle Ben that Peter finally takes the plunge. It's his close family, therefore, that indirectly pushes him to take a step that he's really unsure of taking. It's different, but it fits in so well with this family man version of Peter Parker that Jonathan Hickman is presenting here. What follows is a young dad trying to come to grips with becoming a superhero. Again, this is just so different, so far away from what people know to be Spider-Man, that I initially was both intrigued and recoiled a bit at the same time. Yeah, the story and premise here is great. It's really unique and interesting. But is it really Spider-Man? Is this really Peter Parker? That thought, that concept, kind of kept gnawing at me in the back of my head as I went through each issue month by month, getting up to the current issue in issue 9. Now, it's worth noting that while I gave some of the context and background to the Ultimate Universe, when I myself read Ultimate Spider-Man, I hadn't yet read through any of that. I was just a longtime fan that was attracted to a story of an older, more mature version of Peter Parker. And so, to me, while interesting, this version of Peter felt really alien as well. I mean, you might as well rename Peter Parker to someone else entirely and have Mary Jane be named someone else too, and this story and this idea, it would all still function, right? But see, that's the interesting thing about the Ultimate Universe, and why it's important to at least read the Ultimate Universe one-shot, if not the Ultimate Invasion miniseries before that. The Ultimate Universe one-shot, in particular, sets the tone for what this universe and its heroes really are. See, this is a universe where every known character is both familiar and yet very different from what you know about them. Captain America? Well, he's Captain America in a world where there's no United States of America. Dr. Doom? He's not only a member of the Ultimates, this universe's version of the Avengers, but is actually the Reed Richards of this universe, who's been corrupted and broken by the Maker and is now trying to make amends. Tony Stark is an Iron Man. That's actually his dad, Howard Stark, who he actually has a really good relationship with. And rather than his crusade for good being his own thing, Tony is actually carrying the torch for his father in this universe. Then there's this universe's Hulk, who controls the region most close to China in this new world, and is actually in control of himself, having used psychology, meditation, and modern science to control himself. A little closer to home, there's Harry Osborn. He's the Green Goblin, but he's less so a villain and more of an anti-hero, trying to get revenge for the death of his father. Oh, and he's also married to Gwen Stacy, who is very much alive and very different from her 616 version. So yeah, everything is different, and while there are certainly versions of popular Marvel characters here, all bets are off in terms of what's true about them and what isn't. And viewed through that context, this version of Peter Parker makes a lot of sense, I think. He's not the scientist, but the fundamentals of being a hero, of trying to do the right thing, of keeping his family and his life in balance, those are all here, even if some fundamental details are a bit different. Which, of course, is why this Ultimate Universe and this version of Peter Parker and Spider-Man are so endearing and interesting. It's a Peter Parker we haven't ever seen. A Peter Parker that's a family man, that has his uncle, that is a good father, and that's trying to become a hero, even if he's late to the game in this case. And if the first 9 issues say anything, it's that writer Jonathan Hickman has a plan, and he isn't rushing it. Ultimate Spider-Man is actually really taking its time. It's only at the end of the first issue, for example, that Peter even becomes Spider-Man, and then it's not until the 3rd that we see him actually don the classic red and blue costume. Speaking of which, an interesting side note is that the red and blue costume happens as a result of Peter's daughter, who finds out about his identity first. She's actually scared of her dad's black suit, which is the one he gets first. And it's this young May Parker that ends up inspiring Peter to design a friendlier red and blue suit, one that his daughter finds cool. This is another example of such an interesting and fun way to redo a classic Peter Parker and Spider-Man moment. But the growing pains of being a superhero don't stop at the costume, as there are multiple moments in issue 2 where Peter is fooled by and gets his butt kicked by a B-list villain in this universe's Shocker. And then of course, there's the eventual meeting with the Green Goblin, and the friendship that develops between Peter and Harry Osborn. This friendship here is very different because it actually results from their shared situation of having both powers and tech that they don't understand, and them both trying to navigate the reality of this version of New York and this world's twisted dark secrets. The friendship is because of a shared situation, and not because they've known each other since they were kids. Another thing that's new, different, and will probably be very interesting in the future. And it's not just Spider-Man or Peter, but it's his supporting cast that equally gets some new developments and storylines. Ben and Jonah, for example, are out on their own, trying to make their own newspaper after having quit the Daily Bugle in the first issue. Mary Jane runs her own PR marketing firm and is helping out Ben and Jonah as a marketer, while of course also being a mom. For fans who have been hungering for wholesome, interesting, and character-driven stories that push these established characters in new and interesting directions without messing with their core, it definitely seems like Jonathan Hickman has the goods and is dispensing them through his Ultimate Spider-Man comics. It's not much of a surprise then that Ultimate Spider-Man is doing as well as it is, beyond just selling a ton and beating out the 616 comics. For me, it's actually gone beyond just Spider-Man, and this comic series has also gotten me interested in the new Ultimate Universe and the comic line as a whole. What an amazing thing that is. Spider-Man getting people into more comics and the surrounding material around his stories, propping up the entire comic book line like he used to for the main 616 continuity. It just proves that Spider-Man, if done right, is the beating heart of Marvel Comics, and easily an entry point to their entire comics line. The key character that can either shift and lift up their entire brand, or push people away entirely. In the end, I'll say that man, does it feel great to be a longtime Spider-Man fan these days. Which of course leads me to the big question. How do you feel about all of this? After watching this video, is Ultimate Spider-Man doing it for you? Is Peter Parker too different here? Were you curious about all of this? Or were you already on board? Sound off in the comments, because more so than anything, I'm really interested to hear what everyone thinks about all of this. It's been a long time since I've been this excited to talk about Spider-Man.